Okay, we have Andrew Stellman here today as a guest to our podcast. Andrew is an O'Reilly published author on an Agile book, and he's an Agile coach, project manager, and also have been helping organizations move to Agile. So really excited to hear about your story, Andrew, and hear your perspective on how you coach teams, how you help development teams, and you come from development background, so we're interested in that story too. So why don't you just give us like your background, what you've been doing, what you're up to, what you're learning. So after you, Andrew.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me. So I am a published author. I've written, my co-author Jenny Green and I have written a bunch of books for O'Reilly, including Learning Agile, Head First Agile, and recently a book/report, What is Scrumban? We also have more traditional books in project management, Applied Software Project Management, which is sort of a classic textbook on for software engineering and project management.
Mm-hmm.
A Head First PMP, PMP preparation guide, and the Head First C#, which I'm just finishing up the 4th edition of, which is really aimed at software development, game development with C#. I started out studying computer science at Carnegie Mellon back in the 90s. That's where I graduated from with a degree in computer science. And since then, I've done software development, managed software teams up to anywhere from small teams to sort of large 80+ person teams. A lot of times in the consulting organization, but I spent about half a decade as a vice president at Goldman Sachs and in technology. And over the years, I sort of worked with many teams. In fact, our other book I haven't mentioned yet, Beautiful Teams, we actually did a lot of stories and interviews with people from all over the software engineering, including all over the Agile world. And I spent a lot of that time doing Agile coaching. A lot of times people would, even if I was just working in an organization, but definitely as a sort of just as an independent coach, basically come up to me and come and say, here's my problem with my team. How do I fix it? It's funny. About 10 years ago, we used to do a talk called "Why Projects Fail," and there's this old saying: "There's a million ways to fail, but only one way to be right." But it turns out that's not actually true. It turns out teams run into the same problems over and over and over again. And, there's a lot of different variations, and everybody's the details are all completely unique because teams are unique with unique individual people, but they keep running into a lot of the same problems. And that's one reason, when done really well, Agile is so effective because it's really focused on a lot of those problems that people keep running into. Especially, Scrum. One reason Scrum has, I started working with Scrum back in back in the 90s. Honestly, I think they Ken Schraber wrote Agile Project Management and Scrum in '96, I believe. Yeah. And it's this is before the advent of things like user stories. Yeah. Before we were using tools like Jira, the idea of just the idea of an iterative, incremental approach to software development that where people can really have feedback loops on many different levels. Right. It's just an extremely successful way to build software. It really approaches a lot of the real problems that teams run across.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's great. So I want to pick up on the book title that you mentioned, Learning Agile. And then you also said teams need help on the same stuff over and over. So I just wanted to pick up on that mindset. But yeah, it looks like congratulations on all these publications. That's amazing. So many books. And you've been doing it for a while. You said since like 1998?
Yeah. So we've been, our first book was published in, I think Applied Software Project Management was in 2005. Wow. And honestly, it's, when you look at when you look at the problems people run across, there's a lot of different variations, but
Yeah.
a huge amount of it boils down to what are we going to build? It's not even when are we going to build it by, because no one, it's pretty well known that it's very difficult to come up with, it's both really easy and really difficult to come up with an answer for when you're going to have this by.
Right.
And there's a lot of great road mapping techniques and a lot of great planning techniques for doing that. But
Yes.
the problem with asking when are we going to have this done by is it still comes down to what are we building, because I can tell you reasonably accurately what I think we're going to be, when I think this team, even a large and complex team, is going to be done with this particular piece of software, or this particular part of the project. The problem is 2 weeks from now, we're going to have a different understanding of that project.
Right.
And we're going to be building something different. There's an old project management saying, right? Plan the work and work the plan. But if you plan the wrong work, then you're going to work the wrong plan and build the wrong software, right? So,
yes.
So the whole idea here is really understanding what we're going to be building. And but when you take a step back, it's not really about what we're building. It's about what we're delivering and what value we're delivering to the people we're going to be delivering it to. And that's why when you talk about Scrum, and that's one of the things we talk about a lot in Learning Agile, and also in pretty much everything we've written about project management and product development, is understanding about delivering value. It's all about, can we get something valuable to the users and stakeholders who need it? And there's one thing we always know, is that what they're asking for isn't what we're going to be building, because they don't know the answer to the question yet.
Right.
And so that's one of those many problems boils down to, how do we come up with kind of a shared understanding of what it is we're building? And that's one of the big challenges there.
Yeah, and you come from a development background, so you have a story on how you work with early on your career. You work business user. Yeah. So tell us that story. It's a fun story. I really appreciated that.
Sure. Well, it's funny. This is actually one of my early experiences with Kanban. And apologies to some people like to call it to say Kanban. Some people call it to say Kanban.
Yeah.
I tend to say Kanban. Maybe because I'm from New York, I don't know. So I was working on a team, and it was actually, there were two different managers who were working together. And it was actually it's very, very highly capable team, one of the best engineering teams I've ever worked with. They were running into a problem where they weren't really sure why, but work was just, it wasn't that work was taking longer than they felt it should. It's that a lot of times features that would be going along just fine would kind of just ground to a halt. And they weren't really sure why, but sometimes it's like software would be, the team would be constantly building software, and the work would constantly be being released. But they would look back and say over the last 3 months, these 7 or 8 initiatives just stopped, and we weren't really sure why they stopped. And that was going to be a problem, because it's starting to be visible to their senior management. So they said, well, can you help me with this? And I said, sure. And I was actually working more in a developer role in this team. This happened to be a team where I was mostly doing development, architecture, and basically designing and executing large scale systems, and working with sort of mid-sized teams to actually get code out the door, and doing some amount of coding myself. But I'd also set up a lot of their project management system, and then they'd adopted some agile practices, but the organization as a whole was more of a waterfall organization. So it was kind of this, if you've read about water scrum fall, where you kind of put some scrum practices in place, but in a larger waterfall context, because you just don't have a choice with that. That's what this was. And we got it about as efficiently as we thought we could. So I took over a wall of this office. I got some sort of black low adhesion tape, and taped off columns, and made this giant Scrumban board, giant Kanban board across the entire wall, probably about 15 feet long. And started adding columns as we discovered as we discovered new stages. One of the ideas behind Kanban is you're visualizing the workflow. So what you're doing is you're answering questions. What exactly is the team doing right now? What is happening to the individual pieces of work? One of the tools for that is a value stream map, where you actually map out the specific stages that these work items go through. And so that's what I was doing. And the intention was that we would understand the current process and then set work in progress limits for each stage of the process. That's a very standard Kanban approach.
Right.
And so I started putting take index cards, drawing features on them, work items on them, tacking up on the wall with push pins and moving them along this process. And they started piling up in a couple of columns, and every one of those columns corresponded to a state where a manager was making. It was a very senior manager who had to make some decisions, and as soon as I started talking about it to both engineering managers, they got really uncomfortable. And what this became clear was that they knew exactly what the problem was. That this senior manager just never there were some things he didn't want done, but he didn't want to say no. So he basically just kind of let them languish, waiting for reviews, basically waiting for him to sign off on things, and he never did. So you could see these work items just piling up in those areas. And at that point, they pulled me aside and quietly asked me to take down the Kanban board and never mention this again. Because the last thing they wanted to do was let the senior manager hear that they'd sort of come up with incontrovertible proof that he was the cause of all these things that he was complaining about. And that's actually, the thing is, that's actually how a lot of process improvements and especially agile change initiatives go. Like if you want to, if you're doing you're trying to put agile in place across an organization, you're doing it, you might set up a nice agile transformation team, and you might get all of the senior managers signing off on the whole transformation effort. All right, we're good at it. And then, but pretty soon what it shows is that many times the senior, there's an old saying, the fish rots from the head. And a lot of times, serious process problems, the serious agile related problems happen because people at the top cause them. And one thing agile is really, really good is surfacing those issues. So, a lot of times, when teams look into Scrumban, for example, and this is something I've heard, I don't take on a lot of agile coaching right now because I've been spending sort of most of my time full time with a specific team. But when I do talk to teams to do coaching, I almost always hear the same questions over and over again, or the same comments. We're a Scrum team, but we don't think we have the right person in the product owner role. Or the product owner's not doing a great job of managing their requests. We're following all the rules of Scrum and everything's doing everything right. We're ticking all the right boxes.
Right.
But our stakeholders, they keep complaining. Our users are complaining that it seems like as time goes on, it takes longer and longer and longer for us to get their requests back to them.
Sure. I have a question on that one, Andrew,
Yeah.
if you don't mind. So,
Sure.
You said like a lot of the, I've actually felt it like, a lot of the times, there are challenges in mid or senior management, or there's some concern, right? So what have you found out in working with so many teams? Why do these concerns or resistance, what are some of the roots of that?
Oh, sure. Well, so it all, a lot of it really boils down to the idea that senior managers really want, and it's not just senior managers, often it's a senior architect, often it's a developer who's just in control of an important part of the project.
Okay.
They really adhere to this command and control mindset where they don't, instead of trusting the team to get things done, they really want to really manage how the project's going to be done. They want to say, we're going to do this step and then this step and then this step and this. They want a complete roadmap down to a very micro level of exactly how the software project's going to go. And then they want to be able, that gives them a sense of control. And there's, and the thing is, when you talk about when you talk about agile teams, there's a balance. There's kind of a the yin and yang here. There's command and control, and then there's self-organization.
Mm-hmm.
Agile teams work best as self-organizing teams. And when most people talk about self-organization, one of the classic examples of how teams self-organize is on a Scrum team.
Mm-hmm.
When a project manager will have so if you've got even if a project manager is called, they have the title Scrum Master, if they still have that classic command and control project management approach,
Right.
where they own the plan and they've planned it out and it's their job to make sure that everybody sticks to the plan.
Yeah.
What they'll find is they'll have a daily Scrum or a daily stand-up where everybody's, we're in that meeting. They'll go to the first person on the team and say, okay, what have you done on the project since the last time we met? Okay, well, here are your next assignments. And now what roadblocks can I clear up for you? And they'll go to the next project person. What have you done? When this person says, what have you done on the project? What they're really saying is, what have you done for my plan? What have you done when you've done for the assignments that I gave you? So a classic way to turn this into to help this team become more self-organizing is instead of the project manager acting as Scrum Master asking these questions, instead of assigning the work to the individual people, they leave all the work unassigned. And at that daily Scrum meeting, each person says, here's what I've done since the last time, and here's what I'm going to be doing next. And they assign themselves the next work. And so let's say you've got a 2-week sprint. Well, you've probably spent between half a day to a day, probably about half a day at the beginning of the sprint doing sprint planning, right? And where you've taken the work. If you're using user stories, you've selected the stories that you think are going to fit into the sprint, and then you've decomposed just enough of them into tasks so that you can get started in the first couple days of work. Well, instead of the command and control project manager will then insist on writing somebody's name on each one of those tasks. Say, well, you're going to do this task and you're going to do this task, so they can know over this next 2 weeks of work, they know exactly who's doing what when. They're going to want to order everything.
Yeah.
A more self-organizing team will take those tasks and basically put them in a pile, and everybody knows what they are. And each person will say, okay, I'm going to do this one next. And usually that works out just fine. And the reason you have these daily meetings is the intention of these daily meetings is to actually look at what's happening, and making sure the entire team's on board. And from a technical perspective, you want to do from a technical software engineering perspective, those daily Scrum meetings implement an inspection visibility adaptation cycle, where it's an inspection meeting where what you're doing is you're actually inspecting the plan. That's a classic software engineering inspection meeting that where the idea of inspection dates back to the 60s. And so this is what you'll see is most of the time people will self-assign themselves work and everything will be fine. Occasionally someone will say, I'll do this next, and somebody else will say, well, you know what? Maybe if you do this other thing first, because I know that I'm going to be working on this other piece, and if you wait for me to be done, you'll be able to reuse some of the code I've written for that.
Right.
That's the inspection working. And that's the kind of adjustment that you can't do if you have it's very difficult to do, because if you have a command and control approach rather than a self-organizing approach, where then you actually have to go back and rework the whole plan because there's all sorts of dependencies that'll cascade.
Right.
And it's a difference, not just in approach, command and control versus self-organizing, but it's a different in mindset. Just in case versus just in time. Just in time planning is much more effective than just in case planning. Planning only the amount of work you absolutely need to do and no more. And it's the same just in time attitude. Write only the documentation you need and no more. Do only the testing you need and no more. Which doesn't mean don't test. It means test really, really well, but don't spend all your time planning out your testing. Actually go and build some effective tests. Don't over-architect don't spend a ton of time up. It doesn't mean don't do any architecture. Some of the best agile teams do a lot of architecture planning because they need it, but
Yeah.
don't over plan. Leave things,
Yeah.
leave a lot of things, leave as much as you can up to the implementation. It all comes down to this principle of last responsible moment. Make all decisions, whether it's about planning, architecture, testing, documentation, design, at the last responsible moment. So
Right.
don't wait until it's irresponsible, but if if you can responsibly put off that decision, do it, because then then that means you've decided to make that decision later when you have more data available, and you'll make a better decision.
Yeah. So Andrew, you actually gave us some really good example. And the way that I'm hearing is the command and control. We talked about it. And yeah, in reality, it's not just an agile issue. It's, in our society, we've been dealing with command and control
Yes.
in various different institutions, right? So the important question is, how do you inspire people to let go of command and control, or like how do you have them see the benefits of letting go of command and control so that we can have self-organizing teams?
It's all about one word: trust. You have to
Mm,
trust your teams. You have to trust your process. You have to trust yourself. You have to
yeah.
trust everyone around you. And here's the thing, that's really hard. Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to trust your team. And sometimes it doesn't end well. There's a reality of things. Like in that story I told where it turns out that the senior manager who was complaining the most was the cause of the problems that he was complaining about. Well, a lot of times you're in an organization where you need command and control.
Yeah.
You need, you need, if you talk about the sort of the agile manifesto principles, um, what do they mean when they say comprehensive documentation? Um, well, or contract-based, or collaboration over negotiation. It's
Yeah.
when you're talking about things like comprehensive documentation, we're talking about binders of requirements. When you're
Right.
talking about writing a huge amount of work up front, a lot of times you're doing that because you're in an organization where you have a culture, instead of a culture of trust, you have a culture of blame.
Mm,
Um, I've worked for teams, like I worked for a team where there was this, it wasn't just a culture of blame, it was a culture of fear. Every time there was a bug that was discovered and that made it into production, which literally every single software team in history has done, like bugs make it into production.
yeah.
Um, the senior manager, who could basically fire anyone at will, would
Right.
come stomping out of his office, literally gather the entire group, over 50 people, into a big circle, scream at the top of his lungs, and demand to know who caused it.
I've
Um,
actually been in multiple of those meetings when I was a business analyst, and I was a new business analyst, and I didn't know if it was like a normal thing in IT.
mhm.
I've like seen grown men being yelled at, and
It's, yeah.
it's crazy. Yeah.
Well, that's, so in an environment like that, um, you want comprehensive documentation. You
Yeah.
want, as me, say if I'm a developer, and I wrote some code that turns out to not do what the users think it should do, I want to be able to point to that requirements document that's 50-page long requirements document and say, well, I just coded what was in that document. So don't look at me, look at whoever signed off on that document. And then there's like 12 signatures on that document.
Yeah.
So no one person is to blame. It's like distributed. Because
Yes.
that's a CYA environment. Cover your ass.
Yes. No,
Language.
that is such nice. That reminds me of so many things. Actually, some of the trauma actually being being a business analyst in this team, but it is so true. Like, yes, if you have a culture of fear where people have been punished, like how can you expect them to be transparent? Because they're going to be punished if they are transparent. Um, and it's crazy. It's like, I grew up in Nepal, so where in school, like it was command and control style. So when I was there, I literally remember like felt like being in school where you're being yelled at, and you just didn't have much agency. But uh,
Right.
that's
Yeah,
great.
I actually, my for high school, I went to the High School of Performing Arts here in New York City,
Yeah.
and I studied music, and it's kind of the opposite in a lot of cases. You'd think, it appears to be Like you're given a lot of flexibility and freedom. But when it comes down to it, when you're learning performing arts, there's a lot of you know, I had one orchestra conductor who screamed and screamed and screamed his head off at us. Although looking back a few years later, I realized that he actually cared very much about us and was doing right by us. And it was less about, and what I realized at one point is it was less about him trying to control us and more about him trying to impose lessons on us in his own way. And I feel like in a teaching environment, it's some teachers don't understand the difference between, even if they sound the same, even if they're raising their voice, it's a difference between, are you teaching versus are you just trying to control people?
Right. Yeah.
And incidentally, I want to mention
Yeah.
just how hard a job business analyst is. You know, being the person whose job it is. So I back in the late 90s, early 2000s, I had been an engineering manager, managing a team of software developers and engineers and architects and some business analysts at a small software company here in New York. And then I actually moved, we've gotten enough business analysts and it was recognized that it was an important enough role in the company that I transitioned to doing just managing a team of business analysts. So my job was to hire business analysts and people doing requirements engineering and business analysis.
Yeah.
And it took me practically a year just to hire 6 people because I, really filling that role well, you need somebody who both understands the technology so they can design solutions and architect, they can basically create define solutions for the team that are actually feasible, that can actually be built. So you need to actually understand how you build things and what's built, but they also need to have a deep grasp of the business, not just how the business works, but also the teams, like the people they're going to be working with.
Right.
Like in our case, there was a lot of salespeople and account managers, and they had to actually understand the business of the company.
Right.
That's somebody with both of those sides. That's very hard. Like I ended up finding people who, had 10 or 15 years of development experience, followed by 10 years of business experience, banking experience in this case, or vice versa. As it happened, I hired the best people I could find. And at one point I looked and I said, wait a second, for some reason my team is all women. It just happened that the very best people I found happened to all be women. Yes. I don't know what that says about anything, but that just happens to be the best resumes, the best environment I found. And it was one of the best teams I've ever worked with. It was sad to see them go when I left that job.
Well, one of the things tying back to like the culture of fear and the command and control, one of the things that I felt like a business analyst, even though it was like an agile, it was kind of branded like it was like adaptive agile teams. One of the role of a business analyst is to really understand, the business problems and the needs and really challenge people's assumptions. And, I felt very restricted in terms of showing up and even like sharing those ideas because just of the culture and, kind of the command and control style, because that is the reason why you need BAs. So anyways, that was a really good take. And, that honestly, it just kind of created some ahas for me in terms of tying, self-organization, command and control, what exists in the companies right now and the challenges that I've faced or have talked about. So that's really cool. So let's do a little bit deep dive on Scrum plus Kanban, Scrumban. You've done some. You actually written a book about it.
So this is
simple words. Like, how would you like teach a new team? Like, if they a lot of the times people start with Scrum and they're like, oh look, there's all these tickets coming in and there's no option not to do it, so it's hard to keep up the sprint plan. I've came up with that situation. So how do you coach a new team to do Scrumban?
Okay, so first of all, anytime you're coaching, there's an old saying about teaching, which is teach people where they are, not where you want them to be. So the first step is understanding exactly where they are. And for the most part, people come to Scrumban from a Scrum perspective. And often what you were just talking about, a not particularly well implemented Scrum in the sense that it might be working for them, but it's not particularly agile.
Right.
So I like to go back to what it means for something to be agile to start with. And honestly, I feel like the manifesto for agile development is really a great starting point.
Right.
What does it mean? Individuals and interactions over processes and tools, right?
Right.
Working software over comprehensive documentation. Responding to change over following a plan. What I like to remind people first is when you say this over that, it doesn't mean that we don't believe in planning or comprehensive documentation, but means that we value responding to change over following a plan. So our plan is great, but if we need to change, then we make that change and we figure out a way to build our product so that it can be changed and do our planning so that it's easy to change. And in the same way, like we value comprehensive documentation, but we value working software more. Yeah. And there's no better way, and this is a basic idea of Scrum, Scrum for software teams, there's no better way to give your teams a good understanding of what it is, the state of the software and the state of the project, than by putting real working software into their hands and letting them actually work with it. Right. Like, you have to do that. That's the most important measure of progress.
Yeah.
Now, I like that as a starting point for teaching people about Scrumban, because that first thing they'll say is, well, what about my Scrum implementation? Is your Scrum implementation, is it, are you really iterative first of all? Like, are you really, are really able to make changes? If halfway through your sprint, you realize, wait, someone comes to you and says, we got this other requirement, we really need to make this change. And it's a big change. And it's gonna make a lot of work for the team. Is your first instinct to resist that change and say, well, this is gonna be a lot of work. Let's figure out how we can not make that change. Or is your first instinct to say, well, of course, if that's what we really need and we know that's what we really need, then we'll make that change. Right. Like accepting and understanding change. And that's one of these basic ideas of Agile, and that's really drives Scrum. Yeah. So then where I go from there is help them understand, okay, so what is Scrum? What is Kanban? Scrum, the framework for delivering products. It's iterative, it's incremental. We break things down into iterations called sprints. We have these daily meetings where we inspect the plan. We start each sprint with planning. We end it with a demo where we review, where we demonstrate our working software. And if we didn't build anything, we look our team in the eye and our users and stakeholders in the eye and say, we didn't get it done. Yeah. And then afterwards we have a retrospective, right, where we actually look back and learn lessons immediately and apply them immediately. That's pretty familiar to most of us. Right. Kanban is a little more new for a lot of us, and it's extremely effective. But what Kanban is a process improvement method, and that's the first thing that people kind of have trouble with is, what does that mean? What does it mean for something to be a process improvement method? What it means is is not changing the way you manage your products, because Scrum is about product management and product development, delivery, and sustaining those products. Right. Process improvement is about looking at the way you do things today and figuring out exactly what you're doing now and trying to change it so you can do things better in the future. So in a Kanban, so first of all, it's formulated by a guy named David Anderson, who actually helped Jenny and me with doing some really amazing review for us for our book, Learning Agile, on our Kanban chapter. Is a great guy, really innovative work. And what he does, the idea here is you basically have some very basic important elements. You start with what the team does now, meaning you look at what you're actually doing and try to really understand. Second one is understand the process, using things like a value stream map, where you take an actual piece of work that was actually done and you map it. Okay, so it was in planning for this many days and then it waited, and then it was doing a requirements analysis, and it waited, and then we went to design, and it waited, and then the developers worked on it for these, for this many days, and then the testers tested it for this long, and then it waited for another review. And you look at exactly this actual steps that it goes through. And that'll make a process. And in Kanban, the processes are linear. So you'll see them, if you've seen a Kanban board, it kind of looks like a familiar task board that a lot of Scrum teams use. So we'll have a board both has 3 columns: to do, in progress, and done. A Kanban board will have usually a lot of processes, a lot of columns rather, that correspond to the actual steps that each piece of work goes through. And so they're going to be different for different organizations or different teams.
Yeah.
And what you'll do then is you do experimenting. You set a WIP limit, a work in progress limit, by saying only 6, you say only 6 work items can be in this one stage. And if there's a 7th one that's going to go in that stage, we won't do it, and we're going to work elsewhere in other parts of the project.
Can we do a little double click? Can we talk a little bit more about setting up the WIP limit? I think that's where a lot of people struggle, like why WIP limit, how to set it up, things like that.
Yes, that is, you're right. Well, that's very much the most difficult. There's a lot of difficulty there. So I'm going to take a step back and talk a little bit about flow, just a little bit. And this is the theory behind it. It comes from something called queuing theory. I'm not going to go into much of the math about it, except for one thing. There's something called Little's law. Yeah. And Little's law says that there's a simple ratio, it's proportional, that relates to the arrival rate, the rate at which work items are added to the system, and the total capacity of the system, the number of total work items total in the system. And what we find is that the lead time, when you talk about when the time between when somebody makes a request and when it actually get their hands on what you've delivered to them, that is entirely dependent on that flow. And what sort of a queuing theory says is, you could, if you've got a set of stages in the process, if one of those stages, if one of those stages is essentially causing a bottleneck, although we don't really talk about bottlenecks in Kanban, if you limit the flow there, then you can actually speed up your entire process by limiting the place where things are getting clogged up in the system. Right. And that sounds really theoretical, and that's where a lot of people kind of go off the rails. They're not really sure what to make of it. So what Jenny and I did in Learning Agile is we actually drew a parallel to a doctor's office, where let's say you had to visit a particular doctor, right? And you had to you find out that you actually have to go back a few times, and so you have several experiences in their waiting room, and each time it doesn't seem like there are that many people in the waiting room, but you're waiting forever, and it takes forever to. And we've all had that experience waiting in a doctor's waiting room. So what you would do is how would you use flow, these ideas of flow and WIP limits to kind of improve that doctor's office? Well, you could come up with a simple process. Right. You've got, let's say my doctor, you'll sit there in the waiting room, and then they'll bring you into an exam room, and usually you'll sit there for another few minutes before the doctor actually sees you. Right. So let's say they have 5 exam rooms and 2 doctors. So you can have a whole bunch of people seated in the waiting room. You've got a natural WIP limit of 5 on the exam rooms, because you can only have 5 people in exam rooms, because once you've got 5 people in those exam rooms, you're never going to put 2 patients in the same exam room. Right. People are going to be waiting. So every time you, if you've filled up all the exam rooms, then people are going to just have to wait and sit in the waiting room. Also, there's only 2 doctors. So there's another natural WIP limit on that column for seeing the doctor, because there can only be 2 people in this at any time seeing up, either 0, 1, or 2 people are seeing doctors. Right. So if you were going to draw this on a board, you'd have like a sticky note or a post-it or a next kind of thing. One person for each patient in the waiting room, and then you would move them from the waiting room to the exam room. Every time someone moved to the exam room, and then every time the doctor walked in, you'd move them from the waiting in the exam room column to seeing the doctor column. Right. So what you could find is, since you have this, what you could do is let's say you wanted to adopt a WIP, put in a new work in progress limit. Well, you already have limits on the exam rooms and seeing the doctor, so there's only one other place you can put a limit, and that's the number of people seated in the waiting room. So let's say the office staff said, you know what, we are not going to seat more than 6 people. Usually there's like 10 or 15 people in this waiting room. We're never going to allow more than 6 people in the waiting room. And what we'll do is, if we hit 4 or 5 people, we'll actually pick up the phone and call the people waiting, and who are going to be waiting, and tell them, hey, our waiting room is getting kind of full. We see that you're just here for a regular checkup, and it's not urgent. Can we reschedule you? And when you get here, you'll be the first we'll immediately bring you back to an exam room. You won't have to wait at all in the waiting room.
Yeah.
So you that most people will say yes, of course.
Yeah.
And so they'll be able to put that. Then putting that WIP limit in the waiting room, what they've done is they've reduced the total arrival rate.
Right.
Because they by putting the WIP limit in place, that forced them to reduce the number of people who walk into the door of the office. And by doing that, they reduced the total amount of pressure on the flow, and the average wait time that everybody has will actually go down significantly.
Right. Yeah.
I saw this actually work in real life. So when we are in Minneapolis, when my wife and I are in Minneapolis, we live on a high floor in a large apartment building.
Nice.
And for some reason, when they built this building, they put the swimming pool on the roof.
Yes.
And that's a terrible place to put a swimming pool. The reason you don't do that is because one day, 2 or 3 years ago, this pool sprang a leaked all over a bunch of apartments, luckily not ours, and also took several of the elevators out of commission. So we went down from 4 elevators to 2 elevators. And then at one point, it went down to even 1 elevator. When it went from 4 to 2, that slowed things down. We had to wait an extra 2 or 3 minutes for each elevator. But as soon as it went down from 2 elevators to 1 elevator, so that set that WIP limit down from 2 to 1, the wait times went up from like 2 minutes to 10 minutes. It was unreal, sometimes even 15 or 20 minutes. It was unreal how much just a single extra elevator makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
And that's without going into the actual math and theory behind it, that's a good example of why queuing theory and setting WIP limits actually works. By setting a WIP limit in the waiting room of the doctor's office, you can relieve pressure on the entire process, and the total time that it takes from when you show up to when you leave goes down on average for everybody.
Yeah.
And now here's the thing, and this is also why Kanban is hard. The office staff actually had to do some work. They have to actually call people up and say, well, we have to basically offer you something of value to agree not to come in because we're overburdened right now.
Yeah.
And that's a term for it, when you've got a system that's overburdened.
Right.
Well, what does that look like on a software team, for example? Well, let's say you've got 4 or 5 or 10 steps to your process, and one of those is, senior managers are waiting to review something. Right. Well, let's say that's where things clog up. So you see like 15 or 20 different Post-its or index cards have clogged up in that one senior manager review process. Well, now you have to actually go, if you want to put a WIP limit there, you want to say, okay, let's limit the works in progress, not allow more than, say, 8 work items in this column. You actually have to go to that senior manager and say, you know what, you need to start reviewing these things more frequently, and we're not going to put anything more on any other work items on your desk. Right. Until you get through your backlog. So that's a really hard conversation to have with some senior managers. They're going to be mad. They're like, no, fix it somewhere else. I'm the boss. You're not the boss. You don't tell me what to do. I tell you what to do. Yes. That's, the bosses that we've both had in the past. Like, I'm very fortunate that the managers that I'm working with right now are amazing. And that's one reason that the team that I've been working with lately has, for the last few years has just been incredible, and why I keep working with them. Right. But I've in the past, I've worked with managers who would never put up with that kind of thing. Right. Now when it works well, what happens is when you can actually have a dialogue with your managers and with the people who are making decisions, and you actually can put these limits in place, then what you actually see is, this is especially important when you have multiple people, multiple managers feeding work into the same team, like teams that are doing work for multiple different stakeholders. They'll start doing horse trading. They'll say, we know we only have 6 slots here in this one process column. And one manager will actually go to another and say, look, this one really needs to get done. What can we do? Maybe if I do this now, I'll let you have the next 2 slots.
Yeah.
They start horse trading amongst themselves.
Right.
What you've done is then you've taken the burden and taken it out of the system and pushed it back onto the people who are actually causing the burden, which is the managers putting too much work into the system in the first place.
Right.
That's what Kanban does. That's how it works. And then there's a lot of details to it, like what signal cards Kanbans actually are, how setting up pull systems, and that's what a Scrumban is all about. It's just going into the details of how that works. And we talk a lot about that in Learning Agile as well, exactly how you set up a pull system and what that looks like.
Right.
But before you can even get there, just the basics of what exactly it is to set up WIP limits to improve your process. And the other piece of it is experimentation. You set a WIP limit. We think setting a WIP limit here of 6 will work. Well, that did okay. Maybe 5 is better. Maybe 7 is better. So what you'll do is you'll actually measure the flow through your system, and there's measurements you can take. You can create these cumulative flow diagrams. But really what you can do is just measure your average lead time. Right. The lead time between when someone requests things and when they deliver it. Yep. If the average lead time goes up, then you moved your WIP limit in the wrong direction. If the average lead time goes down, you moved it in the right direction. Right. And it gives you a really simple way to set up these experiments. Set a WIP limit, measure the lead time. And over the next couple of weeks or months or however long it takes for you to decide whether your experiment worked. And then you adjust based on that real information. And that should be very familiar to Scrum teams, because Scrum is all about experimenting. Scrum is all about actually that's what iterative software is about. It's about setting up at the beginning of the sprint, here's what we think is going to happen, and then over the course of the sprint, making adjustments based on real facts. When you read about Scrum, what you'll talk about is, in Scrum theory, is empirical process control. Right. Empiricism, meaning knowledge that comes from experience and making actual decisions, not just guesses, but actually looking at facts and making changes. And if you've got a Scrum team that's based on actual empirical process control, that's actually doing real inspections and making real adaptations based on the facts they've made visible, based on real transparency, then Kanban will make a lot of sense to them. But if you've got something that's calling themselves Scrum or Agile and has adopted a lot of the language, but they're really still just a command and control team, these things are going to sound very foreign to them, because what they're really doing is planning up front, probably because of that CYA environment we talked about earlier. And this probably won't work that well for them, because they've got a culture that might be less based on trust and more based on blame. And in that case, a command and control CYA system really makes the most sense for everybody, because you need that documentation to prove that it's not your fault. Because most important is you want to keep your job for the next year. You don't want to be fired because something went wrong, even if it's not your fault. So that's sort of Scrum in a nutshell there.
Yeah, so you're saying that with Scrum, it's a product delivery framework. You can inspect and adapt, plan. It's an iterative and incremental approach. And then when you combine with more of a flow-based approach like Kanban, you have opportunity to really create that flow and really experiment on how do you improve the process of delivering value. And then you also initially talked about one of the hardest problems is what to build. Have you seen anything around in Scrumban where there is a validated column in terms of inspecting and adapting on, like, okay, we said if we build this feature, this will happen. Has that happened? Because a lot of the times it's a hypothesis when teams are building something for the first time, right? So
well, so that's if you have a team that does that kind of a validation at the end of the process, then you'll show that on your Kanban board. You'll define it, and then you'll build it, and you'll validate it. Um, that that in a sprint review, in a scrum team, your sprint review is your validation.
Mm.
And what you learn from that validation is you didn't build it right, because we never got it exactly right. The whole point is to iterate.
Right.
And I feel like a really good scrum team, under the people on it and the people working with them, understand that that the goal is not to build the perfect piece of software, is to build something based on what we understand, and then learn from it by talking to the people who need the software, and then build something, improve it based on what we learned.
Right.
And one important role of the Scrum Master is to help everybody, not just in the team, but the people working with the team, understand that that's how you work with these people. That's how you work with our team, is we will all work together to try to understand. We as a team will understand that you don't know exactly what you want.
Yeah.
And you as a stakeholder will understand that we can't read your mind.
Right.
And so we'll work together. And you'll understand that when we build something that's not perfect, it's okay, because we'll get it closer next time. And you won't, and because the minute that a stakeholder sees the wrong thing and freaks out, that's the moment that the team closes ranks and realize they have to protect themselves.
Right.
That's because what you've done is you've eroded the trust there. Because
Right.
again, it all comes down to trust. And part of the Scrum Master's role in that servant leadership role is to help establish that trust and grow that trust. Because trust is earned and grown over time. It's not just something you can come out with.
Right.
So that's that. And this works both in pure like Scrum and also in Scrumban and everything in between. Any team, even a waterfall team, works better when you have, and I've worked on waterfall teams that worked really, really well. And it was because we established this trust between the people who needed the software and those of us building the software.
Nice. Nice. And then just to kind of wrap up the Scrumban communication. So like in terms of the planning, just a quick, like what does the planning look like? Cause there's no exact sprint planning. Like what does that planning look like?
So there is, what it is so Scrumban is a hybrid between Scrum and Kanban.
Mm-hmm.
So it's generally built on Scrum and uses Scrum as a starting point. If you're using Scrum.
Yeah.
If you're not quite using Scrum, you start with wherever you are. But generally, what happens is you start with essentially a sort of out of the box classic implementation of Scrum.
Right.
And then you use that process improvement that we talked about, setting WIP limits and doing experimentation, to figure out where you can improve it. Because it's not just those Scrum, the Scrum ceremonies, as people like to call them, the specific, sprint, you'll do sprint planning, daily Scrum, sprint review, retrospective.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just those things that are going to be on a column, but there's other things that you'll learn along the way, that there's other things that go into it, like various reviews with people, various demos, different levels of kinds of testing that you'll do. And your columns will grow past just those basic columns. But what a hybrid is, what makes Scrumban work is that, and what makes it a true hybrid of Scrum and Kanban, is a hybrid of Scrum and anything else is going to preserve the essence of Scrum. And the essence of Scrum is that empiricism, is that empirical process control that we talked about, where you're actually making decisions based on real knowledge. And it has an inspection, visibility, adaptation cycle. And that's going to always be there at the core of it. And you're always going to, which means you're always going to have planning. You're always going to, Scrum is at its nature iterative and incremental. Now you can move into something that's more cadence and it has more of a release cadence rather than iterations, and that's equally valid. Even then, you're still going to be planning. But many Kanban teams really like Scrum and really like the rules of Scrum and stick with them very well and use their improvement to find other places to improve, but might not actually touch the sprint planning at all. Others that have migrated to a more cadence-driven system will have more of a cadence planning, where you plan individual work items, and then the planning becomes a different column on the board that's done. And instead of planning a whole bunch of work items at once, you'll plan them individually.
Nice.
But you're still planning.
Now that sums it up. So thanks for sharing that. What are some challenges that you see teams come across as they're trying to start with Scrumban? Let's say they have decided, okay, we're going to do Scrumban. What kind of challenges or pitfalls that you tell people to avoid?
Sure. So there are two really, really common misconceptions. And unfortunately, um, while some of the people who developed Scrumban, like Corey Ladas, did a phenomenal job. And if you listen to, or you know, you watch Heinrich Nyberg's videos or read what he's written, there you've got some really great information.
Yeah.
If you just search for Scrumban, what you'll find is some really common misconceptions, such as that Scrumban is essentially iterationless Scrum, which isn't true. Like if you actually read the original paper on Scrumban written by Corey Ladas, you'll see, like he actually says, the very first example he has in there is an iterative process that has a time box iteration and planning, just like with Scrum, but it's also set up a pull system. Like Scrumban definitely has iterations unless you explicitly don't want iterations in it.
Right.
But people think, and the reason people gravitate towards that misconception is that iteration is hard. Iteration is where when you don't build something, you have to look your users in the eye and say, yeah, we didn't build it. Where your users are going to come back to you and tell you to change direction, and changing direction can be hard.
Yeah.
You have to construct, and it's where you confront the truth of the truth. And it's a lot easier, especially in the command and control system, to push that truth off 6 months down when you're doing a review. And then everything's blurred, so no one really takes the blame. So telling someone, hey, you can use this thing called Scrumban, which basically means take away all the iterations. People say, yes, I want that, because that's the hard part.
Right.
Well, it's just, that's not true. That's not what Scrumban is. So that's one of the challenges. And the other challenges that I find is that when you have Scrumban is kind of a system of project management. Like where you say, well, what this is you look at a Kanban board with all those columns, it really looks like a task board. A task board is a product and project management tool. You move tasks across it. That's not what a Kanban board is for. A Kanban board is a visualization tool to help you visualize your workflow and discover more things about it and figure out where to put and impose width limits. That's not for project management. But it's really, really easy. And especially if you go into Jira and you create a new Kanban board, you've created a project management tool. And you move items around. And it's really, really easy to look at a Kanban board and say, well, Kanban, that's a project management tool. Kanban is just about project management. It really isn't. It's about process improvement. Scrum is about project management and product development. That's why Ken Schwaber's book from the 90s is called Agile Project Management with Scrum. That's not all that Scrum is about, obviously, but that is a major component of it. Right. And so those two misconceptions, Scrumban as project management and Scrumban as just iterational Scrum, those are, if you search online and read a lot about Scrumban, you're going to find that that's what a lot of things tell you, and those things are not true. And that, so a starting point for like a big roadblock, big stumbling block for teams is getting past those major misconceptions.
Nice. Yeah, great. So another conversation. Let's talk about change. So this is all, there's all kind of transformation going around in companies trying to go agile, trying to implement Scrum, trying to implement Scrumban, and all of this actually requires change. And we all have certain capacity for change. Some people have more capacity, some people have less. What do you have to share about, resisting to change or change in general, which is at the core of agility? So
I'll tell you, and I feel like this is probably a really good thing to for everybody. Like if I wanted to have one thing that I wanted to tell everybody to keep in mind, is that change is really hard. There's a great quote from a fantastic book by DeMarco and Lister called Peopleware. It is a quote in one of the beginning of the chapters. People hate change. They really, really hate change. They really hate it. Yeah. And here's the thing. That's rational. When we're trying to make changes, it's really tempting for us to say, well, those people are trying to resist the change I'm putting in place. they're being irrational. By the change I'm making is totally logical and the right thing to do. Why are they irrationally resisting my change?
Mm.
Um, the thing is, from their perspective, they've probably seen 2 dozen change initiatives and transformations like this that came and went, and they should have just ignored them because it just made their lives hard and then went away.
Yeah.
Now think of it from their perspective.
Right.
Yesterday, if I'm the person asking to make a change, being asked to make a change, yesterday I knew that I could do my job. I knew that, I'd probably, at the end of the week, I'd have gotten what I need to get done. At the end of the month, I have looked good. At the end of the quarter, I might have a good review. At the end of the year, I probably get the raise I expect. But now you made me make this change.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's going to work. I no longer know if I am actually going to be able to do my job.
Right.
You've just threatened that whole thing. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get that raise. I don't know if I'm going to get fired because this change actually screws my whole job up.
Mm-hmm.
When something messes with our ability to bring food home to our families, that it kind of messes with that caveman portion of the brain that says, that hunter-gatherer part of our brain.
Right.
And we resist it. And I have to say, it's not necessarily irrational to resist. From that perspective, it's actually rational to resist that change.
Right.
So my advice to anybody who is trying to make change is empathy. Try to understand it from the people's perspective, the people whose lives you're affecting. Try to understand it from their jobs, from their ability to do their work and to bring food home to their family. And recognize that you need to understand things from their perspective. You need to talk to them, not just get them on board because you got to get people on board because that's what all of our change management books say. You got to get them on board because they're going to tell you where you're screwing up. And they're going to tell you what they need to see in order to be on board with it. Because what they need to know to be able to feel comfortable that they can still do their jobs. That's how you make change work. And that applies not just to agile transformation or even digital transformation, any kind of organizational transformation.
No, I hear you. That is such an amazing point. And that was a powerful point and we're going to wrap up the podcast at that point. So great. It was an amazing conversation, Andrew. Thank you so much. You shared some great insights and people are going to learn and enjoy a lot of this conversation. So you've obviously got several books. You're doing a lot of things. Summer is here. Are you now going to be in Minneapolis? What's the?
We're sticking around New York because my parents are in New York, and we're sort of sticking around to keep an eye on them.
Good.
So
yeah,
I can't wait to get back to Minneapolis just because I love Minnesota.
Yes. So hopefully that happens. And last thing, where can people find you? Where are you like these days?
Sure. You can find me. Go to our website, Stellman-Green, GREENE.com. You can find me on Twitter at Andrew Stellman, just my full name. And you can also find me in LinkedIn at Andrew Stellman.
Yeah, great. Yeah, definitely check out Andrew's book, Andrew's and Twitter. I'm definitely going to follow you. And with that, that is a wrap. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you so much for having me.
Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. We will sure to come back with more exciting videos on Agile topics.